In the heart of the Mediterranean, where empires rose and fell like tides, there stood an order of men bound not by kingship nor blood, but by an oath. They were not princes, yet they built castles that could defy sultans. They were not merchants, yet their fleets rivaled Venice itself. They were healers, who became warriors. And for centuries, their black mantle, adorned with a white 8-point cross, struck fear into enemies and reverence among allies. These were the Knights of the Hospitaller, guardians of the sick, protectors of pilgrims, defenders of Christendom, and perhaps the most enduring enigma of the Crusades. Thunder rolls. The screen cuts to a blood-red banner torn by wind. Origins, the Brotherhood of the Hospital. Our story begins not on the battlefield, but in the quiet courtyards of Jerusalem. Long before swords were drawn and fortresses were raised, the Knights Hospitaller began with something deceptively simple: charity. Around the year 1048, merchants from the city of Amalfi established a hospice near the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Its purpose was humble: shelter and aid for weary Christian pilgrims who braved the long, dangerous road to the Holy Land. In a city often racked by political tension and religious strife, the hospice was an oasis. It was here that a man named Gerard, known to history as Blessed Gerard, emerged as its guiding figure. He organized a brotherhood, not of warriors, but of caregivers. They swore vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Their emblem was not a sword, but the cross of Christ. But history, as it so often does, had other plans. Within decades, the tides of war swept over Jerusalem. The First Crusade erupted. Armies of Latin knights carved kingdoms into the very soil of the East. And with their victories came new dangers. Pilgrims flocked in even greater numbers, and with them came bandits, raiders, and hostile armies. The hospice could no longer be just a place of rest. It had to become a fortress of faith. From healers to warriors. By 1113, Pope Paschal II formally recognized Gerardist Brotherhood as a religious order, the Order of the Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem. This papal bull gave them independence, wealth, and most importantly, legitimacy. They were now accountable not to kings or princes, but only to the Pope himself. Yet the dangers of the road transformed the brothers. Their black robes, once symbolic of humility, now concealed armor. Their hands, once tending to the wounds of travelers, now grasped swords and shields. They became a paradox: monks who killed, soldiers who prayed. And so, the Hospitallers evolved into something the world had never seen before: a military order. Their dual mission was carved in stone: to care for the sick and to defend the faith. The question was, could they live up to both at once? The Crusader kingdoms. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was a fragile miracle, an island of Latin Christendom planted in the heart of the Islamic world. Its rulers needed more than nobles drunk on power. They needed disciplined defenders. The Hospitallers, alongside their rivals the Templars, became the backbone of Crusader defense. They built hospitals in Jerusalem, Antioch, and Acre that stunned even Muslim chroniclers with their scale. These were no mere hospices, but institutions where hundreds of patients could be treated at once. Rich and poor were given the same beds, the same food, the same care. To many pilgrims, it was proof that the Hospitallers embodied Christ's mercy. But mercy alone could not hold the Holy Land. The deserts burned with war. And soon, the Brothers of the Hospital became as famous for their fortresses as for their hospitals. They constructed mighty castles at Bellois, Crac des Chevaliers, and Margat, stone giants perched on hills and cliffs, impregnable to ordinary armies. When the Saracens came, the Hospitallers did not merely defend. They rode out. Their knights, clad in chain and black surcoats marked with the white cross, charged in disciplined wedges that shattered enemy lines. Chroniclers wrote of their ferocity, their refusal to break, their loyalty unto death. But glory has its price. Clash with Saladin. In 1187, the fate of the Crusader states was sealed at the Battle of Hattin. Saladin, the great Sultan of Egypt and Syria, lured the Christian armies into the desert heat, cut off their water, and surrounded them. It was a massacre. The Templars and Hospitallers fought to the bitter end, their knights forming the steel heart of the Crusader line. Chroniclers tell us that the ground was littered with their corpses, their white crosses stained red with dust and blood. Those captured by Saladin were given a choice: conversion to Islam or death. The vast majority refused. Hundreds of Hospitallers were executed, martyrs to their vow of faith. Jerusalem fell. The kingdom of heaven was broken. But the Hospitallers did not vanish. They retreated, regrouped, and rebuilt. For them, survival was not merely instinct, It was destiny. A new home, Acre. With Jerusalem lost, the Hospitallers made Acre their stronghold. The city became their base of operations, a hive of activity buzzing with merchants, knights, and pilgrims. Here, they perfected their role as both warriors and administrators. Their fleets grew stronger. Their hospitals flourished. Their coffers swelled with donations from Europe, as lords and kings showered them with land and privileges. The order of the hospital was no longer a brotherhood of humble monks. It was becoming a state within a state, independent, wealthy, respected, and feared. But even Acre could not last forever. In 1291, the city fell to the Mamluks. The last bastion of the Crusader kingdoms was extinguished in fire and blood. The Hospitallers fought to the very last man, defending the walls until the streets ran red. When the smoke cleared, the Crusader dream in the Holy Land was over. Yet, like a phoenix, the Hospitallers rose once more. Their new chapter would be written not in Jerusalem, but on the seas of the Mediterranean. Exile and the search for a new home, the year 1291 marked the end of an era. With the fall of Acre, the Hospitallers were cast adrift. They had lost Jerusalem, lost the Holy Land, lost the very soil where their order had been born. But the Hospitallers were unlike any other exiled force. They had wealth, immense wealth. Donations flowed from across Europe, where nobles saw them as the last living relic of the Crusader spirit. They had ships, powerful galleys crewed by hardened warriors. And most of all, they had an identity carved from steel and fire. Driven from the east, they turned their gaze to the sea. If they could no longer guard the Holy Land, then they would guard Christendom itself, striking the enemy not on desert sands, but upon the restless waters of the Mediterranean. Fortress of the Cross. In 1309, after years of searching, the Hospitallers seized the island of Rhodes from the Byzantines. This rocky outpost would become their new Jerusalem. The transformation was extraordinary. They fortified Rhodes with towering walls, bastions, and harbours bristling with cannon. The city became a fortress unlike any in the world, a citadel of stone rising from the sea, where every tower bore the white cross. From Rhodes, the Hospitallers became a naval power. Their ships prowled the Aegean, intercepting Muslim fleets and raiding Ottoman supply lines. They were no longer just defenders of pilgrims. They were privateers, corsairs of Christendom, feared by merchants and sultans alike. The black mantles of the Hospitallers were now synonymous not only with hospitals, but with piracy and holy war on the high seas. The Ottoman storm. But empires do not ignore thorns in their flesh forever. Across the straits, a new power was rising, the Ottoman Turks. Expansionist, relentless, and armed with the thunder of gunpowder artillery, they set their sights on Rhodes. In 1480, Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople, unleashed his armies upon the island. 100,000 men landed, intent on erasing the Hospitallers from the map. The defenders numbered barely 7,000. Knights, mercenaries, and townsfolk alike manned the walls. Against them came waves of janissaries, cannon barrages, and tunnels dug beneath the fortifications. But the Hospitallers held. Day after day, night after night, they repelled assaults, dousing flames, collapsing tunnels, and fighting hand-to-hand upon the shattered battlements. Chroniclers tell us that the White Cross was seen waving defiantly even as walls crumbled beneath the thunder of Ottoman guns. At last, the invaders broke. The Sultan's armies, bled dry and humiliated, withdrew. Against impossible odds, the Hospitallers had triumphed. Rhodes remained theirs, but the storm had not passed. It was only gathering strength. The fall of Rhodes. In 1522, the Ottomans returned, this time under Suleiman the Magnificent, whose empire stretched from Budapest to Baghdad. He brought not thousands, but hundreds of thousands. His fleet darkened the horizon. The Hospitallers, under their Grand Master Philippe Vius de El Aladdin, prepared for the inevitable. Once again, vastly outnumbered, they turned Rhodes into a crucible of defiance. The siege lasted 6 brutal months. Cannon fire shattered towers. Mines exploded beneath walls. Disease ravaged both sides. Still, the Hospitallers fought with the fury of men who knew there would be no retreat. When at last the Ottomans broke through, the city lay in ruins. Yet even then, Suleiman, in awe of their courage, granted the knights safe passage. The survivors marched out with banners flying, their honor intact though their fortress was lost. Rhodes had fallen, but the legend of the Hospitallers only grew stronger. Malta, the last bastion. For nearly a decade, the Hospitallers wandered, without a home. They settled briefly in Italy, their fleet still active, their spirit unbroken. Then, in 1530, a gift changed everything. Emperor Charles V granted them the barren island of Malta, a rocky outcrop, windswept and poor, but perfectly positioned between Europe and North Africa. To many, it seemed a consolation prize. To the Hospitallers, it was destiny. Preparing for the Great Siege, Malta became the new Rhodes. Fortresses rose from the limestone cliffs. Valletta's harbours were filled with war galleys. The Hospitallers turned the island into an unsinkable ship, a shield against the advancing Ottoman tide. And in 1565, their greatest trial came. Suleiman, determined to crush the order once and for all, sent one of the largest armadas the Mediterranean had ever seen. 30,000 men, heavy artillery, janissaries, corsairs under the infamous Dragut, the scourge of the sea. The defenders? Barely 6,000. Hospitaller knights, Spanish soldiers, Maltese peasants. Outnumbered 5 to 1, they stood at the very edge of annihilation. What followed would become one of the most famous sieges in history, the Great Siege of Malta. The Great Siege of 1565. The Ottomans struck with fury. Fort St. Elmo, the smallest of Malta's bastions, became their first target. For weeks, cannon fire reduced its walls to rubble. Each night, the Hospitallers rebuilt what had been destroyed. The fighting was beyond belief. Knights fought until their armor shattered, then fought on with broken swords. When St. Elmo finally fell, only a handful of defenders remained alive. They were executed, their bodies nailed to crosses and floated across the harbour in mockery. But the sacrifice of St. Elmo bought time. The main fortresses, St. Angelo and Burgu, were strengthened. The defenders, though few, fought like lions. Every assault was repelled with fire, steel, and blood. The Maltese, inspired by the knights, hurled stones from the walls, poured boiling oil on attackers, and fought side by side with their supposed lords. By September, the Ottomans were exhausted, their fleet decimated, their ranks thinned by disease and desertion. Then came the final blow. A relief force from Sicily landed, charging into the weakened Ottoman lines. The invaders broke. The great army of Suleiman fled, leaving behind their dead, their cannons, their pride. Against all odds, Malta had held. A legend forged. The victory at Malta was more than a battle won. It was a turning point in the war between Christendom and the Ottoman Empire. Europe hailed the Hospitallers as saviors. Chroniclers compared the siege to Thermopylae, calling it a stand of civilization itself against overwhelming darkness. The Hospitallers, once exiles and wanderers, were now heroes of the West. Their black mantle, their white cross, became symbols not just of faith, but of resistance, endurance, and hope. The Golden Age after Malta. After the Great Siege of 1565, the Knights Hospitaller entered their Golden Age. Malta, once a barren island, blossomed into a jewel of fortresses, cathedrals, and harbours. Under Grand Master Jean Parasot de Valette, the hero of the siege, a magnificent new city was built. Valletta, with its grid-like streets, towering walls, and bastions, became one of the most impregnable fortresses of the Renaissance world. The Hospitallers' galleys ruled the seas. They became the scourge of corsairs, capturing Ottoman ships and freeing Christian slaves. Their fleets, painted with the White Cross, patrolled the Mediterranean like wolves. And yet, within the triumph lay the seeds of decline. For with safety came complacency. With wealth came decadence. Splendor and shadows, the Hospitallers were no longer the desperate warriors of Acre or Rhodes. In Malta, they became aristocrats of war. Grand palaces rose within Valletta. Feasts, tournaments, and luxuries filled their halls. They were still knights, yes, but also nobles, politicians, men entangled in the intrigues of Europe. The very discipline that had once made them invincible began to fray. Yet, the order remained formidable. They continued to build hospitals of astonishing scale, treating not only knights, but the poor, the sick, the forgotten. To step into the Sacra Infermeria of Valletta was to see rows upon rows of clean beds, light-filled halls, and physicians tending patients with a professionalism centuries ahead of its time. The paradox endured. Monks in armor, warriors of mercy, feared corsairs, and gentle healers. The age of gunpowder. But history was changing. Gunpowder, cannons, muskets, and the rise of nation-states shifted the balance of power. The Ottoman threat, though still formidable, waned after the Battle of Lepanto in 1571, where a Christian fleet smashed Ottoman naval supremacy. The great clash of civilizations was no longer fought in island sieges, but in the courts and fields of Europe. And in this new age, the Hospitallers began to seem obsolete. The loss of Malta. In 1798, a storm unlike any before fell upon the order. Napoleon Bonaparte, on his way to Egypt, descended upon Malta with a modern French fleet. The Hospitallers, bound by their ancient vow never to fight fellow Christians, faced an impossible choice: to break their oath and resist, or surrender. Some knights wanted to fight to the last. Others hesitated. In the end, divided and unprepared, they yielded. Malta fell without a true battle. After centuries of defiance, the mighty fortress of the Hospitallers was taken in a matter of days. It was the end of their sovereignty. The knights, once rulers of Rhodes and Malta, were reduced to exiles again. Fragmented survival. After Malta, the Hospitallers scattered. Some found refuge in Russia, under Tsar Paul I, who declared himself their Grand Master. Others wandered Europe, stripped of land and power. The age of crusading knights was over. Cannons, republics, revolutions, these were the forces of the modern world. The White Cross seemed destined for history's graveyard. A legacy that refused to die. And yet, the Hospitallers did not vanish. In a quiet transformation, they shed their swords but kept their spirit. The Order of the Hospital returned to its first calling: care for the sick. Today, known as the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, they are no longer a military power, but one of the world's oldest humanitarian institutions. They run hospitals, refugee programs, and disaster relief across the globe. Their white 8-point cross is seen not on shields, but on ambulances and aid convoys. 9 centuries have passed since Blessed Gerard founded a hospice in Jerusalem. Empires have risen and fallen, wars have raged, and kingdoms have crumbled. But the Hospitallers endure, no longer warriors of steel, but warriors of mercy. The mystery of the cross, and so the story of the Hospitallers is one of transformation. From monks to warriors, from defenders of Jerusalem to lords of Rhodes and Malta, from naval corsairs to humanitarians. But their symbol, the white 8-point cross, remains unchanged. 8 points for the 8 Beatitudes, they say. 8 rays of hope. 8 reminders that even in war, mercy has its place. It flooded over castles in the desert, stood against the might of sultans, and today it flies still a ghost of the Crusades. A relic of faith and a reminder that history's greatest legacies are not always carved in conquest, but in endurance. They were the Knights Hospitaller, and their story is far from over.